What's going on, everybody? I wanted to do a quick demonstration of how to run a VirtualBox and install Kali, the operating system, inside of VirtualBox. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because there's a lot of us out there that use Kali and other virtual machines inside of the skills, the labs, and some of the coursework that we've been going through together. So let's strap in and do it to it. And I'll be putting the links below here on the screen so that way those playing along at home can do so. Okay, here we are on the VirtualBox installer page itself. And again, the links are going to be below on the bottom of the screen. And right simply, we just click download VirtualBox 7. Now, why are we staying with VirtualBox for this demonstration? Well, because it's free and everybody can use it. And if you have a decent system, which we'll talk about in a second, you should be able to run any kind of operating system in that virtualized environment. Now here on this page, what we're taking a look at are the different types of VirtualBox 7. Are we running this for a Windows, a Mac, or whatever the case may be? And in this demonstration, we're going to be doing a Windows system. So what we're taking a look at here is Windows host for VirtualBox 7.0.6. And we'll click on that. And it should start a download, which we see up here. And it's that one right there. Now, VirtualBox is a standard installer, but when it opens up, we'll see that we have many different options. Now, VirtualBox is already used on this system, but what we will get in depth on is the actual Kali OS installation inside of that virtual environment. Now, after VirtualBox is installed, this is what you're going to see minus all the virtual machines on the left. So all these right here won't be there, but what you will have is tools up at the top left. Now, that's just having VirtualBox installed to allow the capability to put a virtual operating system on your host station or your physical box that you have in front of you. Next thing we need to do is be able to go get the Kali OS. And here we are at kali.org on the bottom of the screen, and you'll notice that straight away we're at the main site, and we've got, let's go back 1 second. This is the actual main site here. We're going to click on download and see up at the top that we have two options that we're going to pay attention to. The one on the top left right here is the installer images, and that's your standard ISO file, which we will be using for this demonstration. 1 second on the explanation. And then there's virtual machines. Now I have this page open. We're going to take a look at it real quick and see that when we click on the virtual machines link, that we can download a pre-configured and installed operating system of Kali in either VMware, VirtualBox, or any other virtualized software platform that we have for our system. The reason that we're going with the ISO back on our main page of selection here is because when we install it in that ISO form, whether it be on a physical system or a virtual system, we're getting the familiarity and practice of installing an actual operating system. And in this case, it's Kali. So we're going to click on installer images and go to that page and see here that up at the top by itself is a Dragon disk with 64 on it. And that's for 64-bit installer. Now, this is the complete offline installation with a bunch of additives that are mixed in with it. So for tools like Metasploit, MSF Venom, and Wireshark, and a bunch of other administration tools, cracking tools, and other things that we use throughout some of our courses and skills, this is the installation that we want to use, especially if we're going to be moving to that offline environment later on. So if we just click on the download button on the left, it'll actually start downloading. We can see it right there. And then once it downloads, we can move or use that ISO inside of our VirtualBox to do the actual installation, which we're going to go to right now. Okay, chances are that after your ISO for Kali has downloaded, it's inside the downloads folder or wherever the default for your browser is. I'm just doing a zoom in right here to show that we actually have it on downloaded as far as it's completed. So now we're going to pop up over into the VirtualBox and we're going to create a new, let me zoom in here for a second. We can see that you can hit Control N or just select new for a new virtual machine. We're going to call this one Kali Fresh because I have one on here already. You can name it whatever you like. And where the folder is, that's where the actual virtual machine itself is going to be installed at. So all the files pertaining to this one particular virtual machine go into a whichever folder we set it to. 1 second, I'm going to select the folder. So in this case, I'm going to my D drive because I don't want it on my main hard drive that my operating system here is installed on. And that way, if something happens to the actual base system, I can take the external drive that this is installed on and use it somewhere else. That's the beauty behind virtual machines, is that if you have all the virtual machines files, virtual hard drives, virtual memory, and everything like that, isolated in a external hard drive. You can move that external hard drive to another system, and all you have to do is install VirtualBox or whatever virtualization you're using on that new system, and you can import that virtual machine there. Now, once we have that, we're going to, on the third line here, let me zoom in again. It says ISO image. This is where we're going to be selecting in our downloads folder. So let's go to our downloads folder, and we're going to be using the Kali ISO that we installed from the kali.org site. And you can see that it automatically selected a type of Linux and version of Ubuntu 64-bit. So this is just saying that based off the ISO for detection purposes, it can tell that this is a type of Linux. Now we can also go in and figure out some other settings behind this installation. We're not going to mess with the unattended install because we want to do it manually. And then for the hardware, if we wanted to give it more RAM for that virtual machine, aside from what the base is here, which is 2 gigs, we can add more. Remember, you cannot exceed what the physical system has as free. And you can check this in Windows by hitting Control-Shift-Escape to open up your Task Manager, going into your Performance tab, and having your memory selected. And this will tell you and give you a snapshot of kind of how much memory you're using and how much you have free. Now in this case, down at the bottom, let's just zoom in here, we have 32.5 gigs committed out of 40.3 gigs available on this particular system. There's a lot of stuff running on this particular system. But since we know that that's the case, we're free to put in anywhere between, let's say, 2 and 8 gigs of RAM for this one particular virtual machine. The same can be said for the amount of processors. I closed that, but I'm going to open it here again in just a second. You can't go past the logical number of processors on your actual physical host than what you have. So if we open back up our Task Manager, go into Performance, and this time select CPU on the top left, we can see that this is a standard view. But if we right-click on it and change graph to logical processors, this will show us that this particular system has 3, 6, 9, 12 logical processors for this machine, the host, the actual physical computer itself. So we can pick anywhere between 1 and 12. Now, as a personal recommendation, I wouldn't go past 2, especially when we're using this in a non-server environment. And that's just enough to be able to get it to act accordingly, and so it doesn't lag when you're running the actual physical or virtual machine itself. So we'll close that and we'll set our CPU count to 2. Now do remember, out of the 12 available on this physical system right now, whenever this virtual machine is running, we now have 2 less because they're dedicated use out of this virtual machine. Same with the RAM. If we have 42 gigs overall, let's say on this system we have 42, let's just pretend, and we're using 2 gigs, that means the available RAM left on the system is 40 gigs whenever this virtual machine is running. So now that we have that set, we can select hard disk, and we can assign it where it's going to store all the files at. And again, that is the same as up at the top when we have name and operating system. It pulls that directory from the folder that we selected at the beginning. Go back to hard drive, and here we're selecting how big we want the hard drive size. Now this again is based on what the availability is on that hard drive that you're putting all these files on. Now I know that I have at least 500 gigs available on this external drive, and when I allocate this, whatever the size is now taken up. So what we're going to do is we're going to make this an 80 gig hard drive, so the operating system has 80 gigs to work with. Once this is allocated, you can't use that 80 gigs anymore because it stores it inside of that folder, and it's taking up that space on the physical drive that this is installed on. Now for hard drive file type and variant, you could just leave it at VDI, which is for VirtualBox. In virtual machine for VMware, it may be VHD, VHDX, VXD, somewhere along those lines. And you could VMDK, because you could see that we can make this kind of compatible with VMware if we wanted to. But we're keeping this in the VirtualBox environment. VDI is acceptable and no reason to change. So once we finish that, we can hit finish, and then we're going to power on the actual system. Now to do this, up at the top, we can just hit start. Now, once this starts, it's going to read and boot off of the ISO that we have in order to do its installation of the operating system. You'll notice that it opens up a separate window, and inside of here, we have our Kali operating system. Now, this is kind of an inception moment because this is an operating system within an operating system. Now, for us, we're going to be doing a graphical install. Now, you'll notice also on the right, if you hit right control, it will let you out of the virtual machine. So if you're moving your mouse and you can't figure out where it is and why it's locked, hit right control and you should be able to move your mouse around outside of the virtual machine so it's not locked in there. What we have on the right here is the information window, and we can close that because we're not really going to need it whenever we're running this virtual machine. Click back inside the virtual machine. We're going to select our language of English or whatever your preference is. Click continue. Currently for this one, we're in the United States. And we're going to use the American English key mapping for our keyboard running on this particular system. Now, it did detect and mount installation media. That's the ISO that we're using to do this installation with that was downloaded from the Kali site. And as it's doing its installation at this point, it's going to go through a lot of checks and installations and copying files over. And right here, it's detecting whether it has any network capabilities. Now, we can add or take away any kind of networking capabilities, but by default, whenever we use a virtual machine inside a VirtualBox, it has one. And that is allowed to go out to the internet through NATing, where we use private IPs on the inside to go outside of one public IP address. Let's say like our modem that we have for our internet provider. Now, the host name for this is whatever you want to name the virtual machine itself. It's like naming a Windows box on the network. In this case, we're just going to leave it Kali. Go to continue. We're not doing a domain, so we're just going to hit continue because Kali on this one needs to be kind of a standalone installation. Now, for the user, I generally keep it at Kali for class purposes, and the username for the account is Kali. If you're running this on your own in a live environment or you're doing actual work with this outside of class or whatever, please, by all means, select whatever it is you want. And for the password on this, I'm also using Kali, and just as a standard username and password for memory purposes for myself whenever we do classes together. I'm going to hit continue, and it's going to do setting up the clock. Now, I am in the central time zone, so I'm going to select that. And generally, virtual machines will take the date and time of the actual host that it's working off of. So if our physical system, which is Windows right now, is set up for central time zone inside of the United States, the virtual machines will take that too. Now, in the advanced settings, you can definitely turn that off and have it set back to 1981 if you want to. But I'm just wanting to keep it standard installation at this point. So we're going to use a guided, use the entire disk that we allocated already. Now, if you remember, this one was set at 80 gigs. So we're going to make sure that the operating system uses that entire 80 gigs. And it's going to format it as a SCSI2 because that's the physical location inside of the virtual machine. Now, we all know it's virtual, but the operating system sees it as a physical disk because the operating system doesn't really know any better. That 000 we see, that's the actual addressing of a hard drive inside of Linux itself. So this is system 0. I believe it's system 0, disk array 0, hard drive 0, because 0 is a number in Linux. So you start with 0. If we had more disk, it would probably be 001, which would be the second disk. And we want to keep all the files in one partition. And if you're a new user, definitely go with this option. So that way everything's in that one operating system format. Everything is already set in our settings. We're just going to hit continue for finish partitioning and write these changes to disk. Now, what we're also looking at here is how we want to write these changes to disk. It's saying this is what we got so far. It's going to break it up into two. One of them is our kind of a base partition that it keeps all the disk information on. And then the second partition is what the actual operating system is on. No reason to make any changes. We do want to write these changes to disk, yes, and then we will continue. It's going through its full installation now. So at this point, walk away, grab a cup of coffee, grab a snack, because this will take a couple of minutes to do. So I'm going to pause and wait for this to finish, and we'll be right back. All right, and we're back. And this screen right here is telling us what kind of software do we want on it. Good to keep this as default for right now. No reason to worry about it. We're just going to hit continue. And once the software and select and install software, what it's doing right now is catching up with the main repository so that it can do an apt get and an apt update, which is something that we'll talk about later on in some other Linux fundamental classes, because those commands right there are kind of universal across different flavors of Linux. Okay, so after that long anticipated wait, I know it was tremendously long, and actually in real time it took about 15 minutes for this to install all of its apt-get and apt-update files and operating system files on this virtual machine, so be prepared for that. One of the last things it's going to ask us if we want to install the grub bootloader, and that is kind of like the master boot record for in Windows, if you would, but for, in this case, Linux, and it's default, so we want no reason to change it. We're just going to select yes and continue. We're going to select the device that we're actually using as our hard drive. In this case, it's dev/SDA, and that is how you call upon that drive in the Linux file system. More for later. And then it's installing the master boot record or grub bootloader, as it would be in the Linux world. It's going through and doing that and should be finalizing the Kali installation here pretty soon. See, right there, finished installation. So we're actually right on time with how this is supposed to be going. Once it's doing its finalization, it comes back to says finish the installation, installation complete. We're going to hit continue. It's going to do a quick reboot and come back into the actual virtual machine itself as if the installation was done and the operating system is functional like a physical box. Because in our mind it is, right? So here we are, we're rebooting the system. Now F12 will take you into the BIOS of that virtual machine, and you can see here that inside we get two options. I'm going to move the buttons real quick so it doesn't auto select. If you want to do an advanced option, let's say we want to go inside terminal only, that would be for advanced. Standard usage would be in Kali GNU/Linux. We're going to hit that, and it's going to go through its boot up. And behind the scenes, let's hit our right control and move our mouse out real quick. You can see that it has the information of this virtual machine that's on there, as far as like system, display, storage, audio network, all sorts of base information that you would get for a physical system, except in the form of a virtual machine. Now we're back on our virtual machine and we see it in front of us. Don't worry about the error of failed to send a message, because we don't really need that right now. What we are doing is waiting for the operating system to boot up and give us a first time usage. It's loaded up and we're at a soon to be all too familiar login screen for us, hopefully. And remember, we set this as Kali as our username and Kali as our password. We hit enter and it loads up into the actual desktop of Kali, and our installation is complete. Now that we're inside of our Kali box for the first time, I just want to show real quick that you can right click on the desktop and go to open terminal here. And with the very basic of install in our VirtualBox, we're going to do a quick apt-get and apt update, just so we're familiar with how to do updates inside of Kali in our basic installation under a NAT. So we're using that public IP address into a private IP address like from our internet provider. So we would say sudo, because this is something that needs to be ran with administrator privileges, and sudo is, I believe, super user do, so do it. And we're going to say apt get update, and we're going to input our Kali password, and it's going to hit on a couple of sites that's already in the standard configuration to make sure that it can read the update list. Now, since this is a brand new installation, it's not going to have anything to update as far as the repository list. Now, the next command is upgrade, and we run this after our update so we know what to upgrade. Same thing, and it'll say right here that there is stuff that we need to upgrade because it wasn't already, the list was updated, but it wasn't put in the standard configuration. So we would just hit yes. It's going to go and do its installation here real quick, very automatic, runs through to the end, and it goes back to its actual command prompt. Be right back when it's done. Now, depending on the speed of the VM that we have set up inside the VirtualBox, you know, processors and RAM and stuff like that, this may take anywhere between 5 minutes or 3 hours, depending on how much there is to update and everything. So that is a lot of work that we put into this. we can go ahead and close this. But if there are any other tools that we want to get from the Kali repository, don't forget that we can go to Kali Tools as a list of everything that is available to us. And again, I'm going to have the link below, but this is where we can come and search for any kind of tools that Kali may have to offer. And there are ways to bring in other tools separate from the actual Kali repository, which is something for later on. But let's say that we're looking for John the Ripper, and instead of browsing through the entire list, we could just type in John, and it will show us that there are different packages that we can go for reference and for the actual command line on how to install John the Ripper. So usage, examples, and everything's in here for you to be able to go through and play with some of the tools that are available inside of the Kali operating system. Now, I did mention that this is a lot of work that we put in. And at any time, we could pause the machine. If we go back over to our setup here, we can see down on the bottom that Kali Fresh is running. And we can go right-click and go to pause. And that will free up the resources of the processors and the RAM that we have allocated to that system until we start it back up again. But like I mentioned, that is a lot of work that we put into this. And overall, we took about 3.5 hours in real time to get where we're at right now. So let's do something called take a snapshot. And we want to click on the little information box. If we zoom in there, we can see that. And we can see that there's a snapshot option there for us. If we open that up and we're here at this window, we can see that we're at the current state. If we take a snapshot and we call it, let's say, fresh install, it's taken an online snapshot. And what it's doing is giving us a point where we can revert back to in case we mess something up, or if we do some changes or we don't like them and we just revert back. Because now here we are at our running state, we can just right click or click on the fresh install and go to either delete or right here, restore. But the machine has to be completely off, not just in a pause state for us to be able to restore. And that's why it's not highlighted right now. And remember, the current state is where we're at. And we can make snapshots of every step along the way. So that way we don't really have an incident where we have to revert the whole machine back to the beginning or reinstall the operating system. Now, I definitely encourage everybody to go out and download VirtualBox or install VM Workstation from VMware and practice on that. But VirtualBox is the free option. It allows us many different tools to be able to run an operating system without having to buy a whole nother computer. And it helps during classwork, coursework, skill work, whatever, or just general practice, whichever we're doing at that time. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.